Today I speak with Andrew Copson, president of Humanists International, about the Declaration of Modern Humanism, released earlier this year. It's a wonderful conversation that seeks to crystallize humanist thought from around the globe. And we discuss not just what is contained within the Declaration itself, but also how it has evolved from previous versions that were published in 1952 and in 2002. Andrew Copson was appointed Chief Executive of Humanists UK in 2009 and elected President of Humanists International in 2015. He is a former director of the Religious Education Council, the Values Education Council, and the National Council for Faiths and Beliefs in Further Education. His books include the Sunday Times bestseller, The Little Book of Humanism, and The Little Book of Humanist Weddings with Alice Roberts, Secularism, a very short introduction, and the Wiley-Blackwell Handbook of Humanism with A.C. Grayling. And now my conversation with Andrew Copson. Welcome to the Podcast for Inquiry, brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada, a national educational charity supporting your community for reason, compassion, and secular humanist values. You have answers, we have questions. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood, board member and secular chair for CFIC. Welcome. Andrew Copson, thank you so much for appearing with me today on Podcast for Inquiry.
Thank you for inviting me.
I want to start with a big question. You're the Chief Executive of Humanists UK, so can you tell me and our listeners, what is humanism?
Oh, well, it is a big question. The word humanism has been used in the English language to mean a large number of things over the years, but the way in which today's humanist organisations use it is a use that it's had in UK English since about the mid-19th century, and that is to describe a certain non-religious approach to life, an approach to life that focuses on, centres questions of human well-being, human welfare, human fulfilment, that takes a naturalistic approach to deciding what might be true and what we should give provisional assent to in terms of truth claims, and puts human welfare and moral responsibility at the centre of ethical questions, while believing that as a consequence of science and the use of reason to understand ourselves and the universe, this is the one life we have, and it's our obligation in that context to make it a good one for ourselves and others. So it's an approach to life, it's a worldview, it's a set of beliefs and values. It could be called many things, but the one I prefer is to say it's an approach to life.
A philosophy that centers human thriving and human freedom. Is that?
Yes, I think so. But the human freedom to the extent that it's because it's desirable for human happiness and fulfillment. Yeah.
So, Andrew, it seems to me when we're talking about a non-religious, non-faith-based, evidence and reason-based approach to life, that clearly you don't endorse sacred scrolls or any form of scripture that cannot be questioned. So why then do you think it has been important for Humanists International to have a manifesto or a declaration in its now its third incarnation?
Well, the reasons today are very different from, I think, the reasons that, well, they're to some extent different from the reasons in 1952. In 1952, when the original Declaration of Humanism, that was known as the Amsterdam Declaration, because it launched in Amsterdam, was written, the word humanism was far less well known. It had perhaps more multiple meanings than the fewer that it has today. And there was a need for an organisation that was first forming, because it was the founding declaration of what's now Humanists International. There was a need for an organisation first forming to explain what it was about, explain what the basis of its interactions and commitments and agendas for the future, its activities would be. Today, I think there is still that need to describe for people who are encountering perhaps the concept of humanism for the first time precisely what it entails and contains. But there's also, I think, a function today in the new Amsterdam Declaration that there wasn't quite in 1952, because we simply have now so many organisations in so many different countries whose starting cultures and positions, vocabularies, and the background philosophies of the societies in which they've come about, we now have so many that diversity calls for something that is unifying. And I think that the more contemporary purpose of having a Declaration of Modern Humanism then, now as compared with 1952, is to give a certain unity of identity to all those disparate organizations, because, you know, it's not every language in the world that understands the word humanism or has even a cognate for humanism in their own native mother tongue. And so to be able to have a clear definition that everyone can be working with gives a sort of identity, a unified identity to this movement.
I've read the 1952 and then the 2002 and now the 2022 version. Something about the years ending in two seemed to.
We have taken an anniversary-led approach actually to the revisions, yeah.
But each declaration, you can see that there's a consistency in thought processes, but they were also very much a product of their time.
Oh, yes.
So, for example, man or men is mentioned 5 times in the 1952 Amsterdam declarations. Like, we call upon all men to proceed with to join us in this endeavor and that sort of thing. And that's replaced by human in the 2002 declaration. I like how this demonstrates that even within humanism, there's no dogma. These declarations are subject to evolution and and improvement, and that even as humanists, we sort of a central tenet. I identify as a humanist, a secular humanist myself. That there's a continuous need to improve step by step, and what we hold dear today is subject to question and refinement and improvement. So, in the most recent version, the one that was just published earlier this year, what are the changes in the 2022 declaration that you want to highlight and that you're most proud of that were made?
Well, you're right that the good thing about changing the declarations over time is that it highlights precisely that, the evolution of thinking according to the best evidence available at any particular time, which is a hallmark of the humanist approach to everything. And I think the changes that we were most keen to reflect in the new declaration when we began to discuss it in the commission, there was a commission appointed by the Board of Humanists International, appointed so as to be diverse globally, so as to be ethnically diverse, so as to be balanced, male and female, and so on. It was it met a few times, and then the declaration was given to consultation of all the members of Humanists International, and so on and so forth. So it's quite an open process. I think the changes that process threw up, there were 3 that were most significant. I think firstly, there was a desire to reflect to a greater extent than previous declarations had reflected the genuinely global nature of humanist organizations and of humanist thought. There has been a growing recognition especially in the last 10 to 15 years, that humanist ideas, the ideas, beliefs and values that we now call humanist, at least in the English language, call humanist, are not just the modern products of the Enlightenment West. They have not just their antecedents and ancestors, but their direct analogues in all sorts of cultures, in all parts of the world and across time. And so making that point was very important. That's the first thing that definitely changed in the evolution of the declaration. The second thing was that we wanted to reflect a little bit more clearly some of the global existential priorities that we're all now as a species aware of, climate change being one of them, of course, the way in which human beings have to now pay much more ethical attention to the whole environment in which we exist. And we reflected that with a relatively light touch, because they've still got to have, the declaration is still a general statement rather than a specific policy statement about the climate crisis. So the second thing was to reflect some of those more today's debates. In 1952, it was all about, is humanity going to destroy itself in the Cold War? Right. That's what read between the lines of the 1952 declaration. That's a lot of what it's about. I think if you read between the lines of the 2022 declaration, you'll see, are we going to confront the big challenges that face us and save our species from a different sort of threat? And then the third thing that where we reflected a certain change in not in substance perhaps, but certainly in tone, was where we explicitly committed to addressing systematic inequalities and injustices that arise out of prejudice and discrimination. So in the past declarations had always, said, right, discrimination, things that violate human dignity, things that compromise the universality of humanity, and the equal ethical obligations that we have to every person, these should all be eliminated. We should see the human race as one, so on and so forth. But we hadn't expressed in such clear terms as the 2022 declaration does that we really are taking aim here also at the structural inequalities that arise from prejudice and discrimination. And racism, I think, is obviously one of the most obvious in global terms, but we name also in this declaration all of the inequalities that arise from prejudice and discrimination, and that is making that explicit, I think, was the third important thing that we wanted to do with the new declaration.
Right. So if someone, I realize that I've been talking about some of the changes between the different versions of the documents, but before we get into that a little bit more, would you like to take a moment and sort of explain the overall theme and purpose and the content of the declaration? And if someone wants to read it, where they might find it, and I'll include a link to I'll include a link to all three in the show notes, so you can look at the show notes and get a link to them. But why don't you take a moment and describe what is the this year's Declaration of Modern Humanism?
The way it's framed, we frame it from the beginning, is what we want to do with the declaration is to make people aware of the essentials of the humanist approach to life as they're currently best described today. So we say humanist beliefs and values are as old as civilization. They have a history in most societies in the world. Modern humanism is the coming together of these long traditions of reasoning about meaning and ethics. This approach has had huge impact on the world and on our civilization, and we want to make people aware of what these essentials are of the humanist worldview today. And then really we do that in four parts. We say humanists are people who are trying to be ethical, that a humanist view of morality is that it's inherent to the human condition, it's grounded in our abilities to suffer and to flourish and to feel that, to want to help and not harm. And that's the context in which, as I was saying a moment ago, we talk about rejecting prejudice and racism. We talk about the balance between personal responsibility and human rights, and that sort of like ethical proposition that humanism entails. And then secondly, we talk about the desire of humanists to be rational, to measure our beliefs to the evidence, and that science and free inquiry are our best practical ways of solving many of the problems that confront humanity, not just being a good way sort of in theory and in practice to find out what's true, but are also tools with which we can make human lives better and face some of the big challenges that threaten us as a species. And then thirdly, we talk about how important it is to humanists that people should live happy lives, fulfilled lives, worthwhile lives, good lives. So we talk about the values of joy and fulfillment and all the different ways in which people might find that, whether it's artistic endeavors, the power of the imagination, enjoyment of the natural world, the arts, human comradeship, the quest for knowledge, physical sporting endeavor, all the things that give life color and meaning and depth and purpose for people. And then we say, sort of in conclusion, that this approach to life is one that we think is an alternative to dogmatic religion, sectarianism, selfish nihilism, and nationalism, and all the sort of bad forces that are present and commanding too many people's support in the world today. And what we try to do then, at the culmination of the declaration, is to say that all of this gives us a certain sort of hope. We're not just describing here a worldview for its own sake. We're saying this can be the saving of us. This is a good way, a productive way to view ourselves and the world, and that we hope people see that reflected in the sentiments of the declaration and the human potentialities that it illustrates. And so we call on people who do support these ideas and encounter them in the declaration to join us in their own national humanist organizations and in the international humanist movement to advance these ideas as the solutions to our problems.
I've thought of myself as a secular humanist for quite some time now, and I wasn't aware of this declaration until very recently. And the way and I was really happy to read it. The way I've thought of things, because I have been accused of nihilism, like if there is no God,
yes.
then there's no purpose, right?
Oh, that's
and
such a strange
you don't
claim,
actually have a positive philosophy. You're only denying.
Oh dear.
And I came up with a rejoinder to that, because that did not describe my view of the world. And I said, no, I don't believe that there is some sort of celestial safety net, that our greatest triumphs and our most horrific acts are our collective responsibility. And that's why our choices and our decisions matter. If we are to thrive, it's up to us to do that. And we are, of course, constrained by the laws of physics, chemistry, biology, by scientific laws in the universe, the rules under which the universe operates. But within that, we have enormous freedom of choice collectively, not necessarily individually for everyone. And how we structure our societies and how we interact with each other is up to us. And that's what makes it that's why our choices matter. That's what makes ethics and morality and living a good life important. But to see
That's right.
those ideas, like, and this is just me talking to friends and doing this on my own, but to see this philosophy sort of codified from from thinkers from around the world,
yes,
it gave me great hope, and I found that. So I want to thank you for your efforts.
Thank the whole Commission and the General Assembly. Yes,
the collective you for doing this.
No, it was a great piece of work, and I think we're very lucky to have had so many people willing to dedicate the time to it. First of all, the General Assembly for accepting that an update was a good idea, and then to the commissioners for joining us in that endeavour. I think you're right about the benefits of seeing something written down and described, because some people who are perfectly happy and content in just going about their lives with these beliefs and values will say things like, "Oh, why do we need a word for it? Isn't it just common sense? Isn't it just what I think? Why do we need to get together under the banner of it and so on?" And I think it's important that we do. It's important because a lot of people don't have the full courage of their convictions or confidence to express their values and beliefs in this way, and they may go through their lives thinking, what have I got? This rag bag of beliefs and values that are in my head. Maybe really they're because of my religious upbringing, or maybe they're just things that I think myself. And one of the values of this declaration is to say, no, these beliefs and values that you have, they're not just a random assortment of things that you've picked up. There's a coherent worldview, very probably there. It's a worldview with a long tradition. Has inspired some of the greatest contributors to human welfare and fulfillment through time. There's a word for it, there's a name for it. And once you have a name for something, you can think about it even more. You can develop it further. You can interrogate the beliefs and values that lie underneath it. You can talk about it. So I think the naming of something and the describing of something, and then, as it were, the promulgation and promotion of something is very important. So I'm glad that it's had that beneficial effect for you. I think on the individual level, that's one of the things the Declaration hopefully can do.
Yeah, one of the new concepts introduced in this year's declaration is a duty of care to all sentient beings.
Yes,
and I found that was sort of a fascinating addition for a number of reasons. One, it led me to think of how. Because sentient isn't defined in the Declaration, and so whether where that line is drawn, and like whether it includes dogs or fish, oysters, maybe trees, aliens, perhaps. I mean, we don't
artificial
know
intelligence.
Given the number of planets in the universe, that there's sentient, or that there's life somewhere else. I've changed my mind in the last 20 years. I used to think of it as highly improbable that there was life in any meaningful sense elsewhere, and now I think it's highly improbable that there isn't. So how do you think sentient is defined in terms of the duty of care that's in the Declaration? And sort of, this may be quibbling, but should a humanism declaration actually include other species? And because clearly you think the answer is yes, and so why you decided to include that in the Declaration?
Well, we were drawing on a long tradition of humanist thought in relation to our human obligations to other entities that can suffer or feel pleasure, and in fact, I think humanists have probably the strongest record here of any worldview in terms of their track record of ethical thinking about our obligations to non-human entities. Jeremy Bentham, of course, great humanist philosopher, who famously said in the 18th century when talking about our moral obligations to others, the answer is not can they reason, but can they suffer?
And he developed what is now known as utilitarianism.
That's right. Charles Darwin, of course, making the same points in his work about emotions in other animals. Peter Singer, in his own work, gone a lot further to talk about in terms of rights of other animals and so on. So I think that it's inescapable if you've got a morality that is entirely focused not on obedience and commandments and doctrinally set rules, but instead is focused entirely on your obligations in light of the other person's ability to suffer or ability to feel pleasure, then when you're confronted with any entity that can suffer or feel pleasure, at least a large part of the same moral rules that apply to your treatment of other people, other human animals, will apply to them too. And like I say, that could be the animals that we know, the animals that we've grown up with in this world, like you mentioned, dogs and so on. Or it could be other forms of intelligence from elsewhere, or it could be other, if such thing ever is possible, synthetic entities that are sentient. Our same moral obligations would apply to them. So I think we felt we were very much going with the grain of the humanist tradition in adding that to the Declaration. I suppose we also thought it was timely because humanity's impact on other creatures capable of suffering is immense these days. Not just the use that we make of other animals in terms of food production, but medical experimentation or labour. It's obviously has never been greater than it is today. All of those things, but also the impact that we have on the environments in which those creatures live, and of course the potential, as we alluded to earlier, of human beings synthesizing sentient entities as well. So those things just seem to make it timely to give an explicit reference to this in a declaration of now. But I think we felt we were going with the grain of humanist thinking. We didn't feel like we were saying anything new to humanists. It's just giving it the prominence in the Declaration that was new.
Yeah, and I think that's actually another example of the evolution of humanist thought over the course of decades.
Certainly the evolution of priorities, yeah.
One of the things that I was very happy to read, and this is in all three versions, including back in the 50s, is that, and this phrase appears in all of them, the right of every human being to the greatest possible freedom compatible with the rights of others. And that last bit, compatible with the rights of others, is something that at least in today's discourse, I fear is being forgotten. I have a right to something, and the impact of my actions on anyone else is irrelevant because it's just my right to do this thing. And that others have rights as well. And if I take an act that infringes or puts limits on other people's rights to express themselves or their freedom to do things, that this has been a part of the humanist declaration for 5 decades.
Oh yeah,
7
yeah,
7 decades now. Sorry, I was thinking 52. No, for 7 decades.
No.
I think that's a testament. And I want to call that out because I think that's wonderful that that has been there and remains there.
Yeah, I mean, it's foundational, really, and it was also, it was in all of the other documents that preceded the Amsterdam Declaration. Right back into the 19th century, it's foundational to the humanist organisations that were cohering in the course of the 19th century. And of course, it was an idea very prominent in the political philosophy of the 19th century, of liberalism. If you think about a humanist thinker like John Stuart Mill, or if you think in the 20th century of the framers of human rights instruments, I mean, when which of course have a history, they didn't just come from nowhere in the middle of the 20th century. There was substantial ethical thinking behind those ideas of human rights from the 19th and early 20th centuries, often by humanists, often by people with either a humanist approach or who were explicitly members of humanist organizations. And so that idea of your rights extending as far as the rights of others, and not going further than interfering with the rights of others, is, I think, absolutely classic foundational humanist position. And when you really apply it to real life situations, especially today, can lead to some quite easy answers to questions that present as quite difficult. Why shouldn't X just be allowed to do whatever they want in this or that context, is often the question or the claim that's being advanced, and this balancing of rights and interests that's inherent in that phrasing that you just described is the answer, and is the key to unlocking a lot of those apparent conflicts.
Yeah, my father used to say, and this is of course, as a child, I thought this was his, and of course, it's very common, that your right to swing your fist stops at the bridge of my nose.
That's John Stuart Mill.
Oh, that goes back to Mill, does it?
That's his. I think that's his exact formulation. Yeah.
Well, I of course, everyone thinks their parents are ancient, but I think Mill precedes my father by a few years at least.
Well, he was a good liberal then, your father, by the sound of it.
Yeah, I don't think I've strayed too far from my upbringing in that sense. Another way in which I found the Declaration's evolution very interesting was in the 1952 version really seemed to be against religion. It says that it's an alternative to religions and totalitarian systems. The 2002 version drops totalitarian systems and says it's a response to dogmatic religion. And then this year's declaration keeps dogmatic religion and adds authoritarian nationalism, tribal sectarianism, and selfish nihilism. And I'm interested what led to these additions and the process, and why you identified these as what humanism is an alternative to.
Well, I think we became very aware. I mean, you're right. This is a major way in which the Declaration has been updated. Actually, I think we were very aware that today, although dogmatic religion remains a serious threat to humanist values and an existential threat to the world, that there are so many other threats to humanist principles today than just dogmatic religion. It's obvious if we look at China, the regime in China, or the regime in Russia, although it cloaks itself in religious language and has quite a lot of religion in it, but is not primarily religious. It's political. It's authoritarian. We thought that was a massive threat to humanist values in the world today. We thought that nationalism has become a more and more significant threat to human rights and to the universal nature of human rights. I'm not saying universalism ever in the 20th century held massive sway over people, but at least it was paid lip service to by the governments of the world. Now there are many governments in the world for whom that don't even pay lip service to it. Russia will talk instead about traditional values. China will talk about national values and so on, and all pretense of human values and human rights goes out of the window. And then we thought that in the West in particular, but not just in the West, in the democratic world, let's say in the capitalist democratic world, that individual selfishness and nihilism sometimes even a sort of fatalism, a turning away from the belief in the potential of human agency and human possibility, a feeling that, well, problems can't be solved. We need not try. Systems don't work. Human solutions can't work. Let's just, give up on that. That all of these forces were forces that were hostile to threats to humanist beliefs, humanist values, humanist aspirations, and we wanted to name check them all, really, because they were all, it's a struggle on many fronts at the moment, rather than just on the two fronts that we were perhaps facing in 1952. Communism on the one hand, and then conservative religion on the other. It's a much more, the threats to humanist values are much more multipolar than they were, unfortunately, in those days. I must apologise, by the way. While I was speaking just earlier about John Stuart Mill, I decided to take this opportunity to look it up. That right's end, where the fist of the nose, and I'm reliably informed by the internet that it is a misattribution to John Stuart Mill. So I was wrong to say that it was John Stuart Mill, and in fact, on these very useful sort of quote checker websites, it turns out that it's used in 1939 by an American lawyer, Arthur Garfield Hayes, who was the general counsel for the ACLU. It's sometimes attributed to Oliver Wendell Holmes. It's sometimes attributed to Abraham Lincoln. It's sometimes attributed to John Stuart Mill. It is used to describe John Stuart Mill's philosophy. It sounds like it's a bit like that Voltaire quote, that he never said, about how he disagrees with what you say, but he'll defend to the death your right to say it.
Yeah, I was so disappointed to learn that Winston Churchill never said almost all the things that he's known to have said.
Yes, that's true. Yes, yes. Well, some people with Churchill's reputation these days are quite pleased if they end up not quoting him. So
now I'm upset that my father isn't on that list of people to whom that's attributed.
Well, yeah, that's right. You can put him on there.
Just a couple more questions for
sure.
you. You mentioned that there's now a proliferation of people espousing values that resemble humanism or are humanism, but
yes.
in different groups. And there's Humanists Canada. I'm speaking to you today from the Centre for Inquiry Canada. There's the Canadian Secular Alliance. So even within Canada, a nation of 37 odd million.
Oh, I didn't know about this Canadian Secular Alliance. That's good.
There's there are a number of overlapping, compatible, but still quite distinct organizations. When reading about the declarations, I came across the Humanist Manifesto, and like the Declaration, it also has had three iterations going from 1933, then 40 years later, 1973, and then 30 years after that, 2003, there was a third version of the Humanist Manifesto. Are you aware of that and the differences between the declarations and the manifestos for humanism?
Oh yes, I mean the manifesto is a much more North American product. Really, that's where it's always been led from. I think it's had signatures from around the world, but it started its life, I believe, with the American Humanist Association. Which had
it's a product of the American. Yes, that's right.
A slightly different focus from other humanist organizations at the time, in that they very explicitly arose out of religious origins, Unitarian origins and so on. So yeah, the Humanist Manifesto through the 20th century is another very good example of people trying to get together to give some shape to these ideas.
In 2052 or 2062, presumably there'll be another declaration of humanist values, another Amsterdam Declaration. I'd like you to put on your prognosticator's cap and say,
oh, no.
What things that are in this, what's going to be added to the next version in decades to come? What do you think will be the issues that will be important enough to be incorporated into the next version?
Well, of course, I've got absolutely no idea, and especially in such fast-moving times, it would be, it's always been foolish to try and predict the future, but it's especially foolish to try and predict the future today when things move and change so quickly. I would imagine that something that, well, I'll do it anyway, even though I said it's foolish to try and do it. I should be 72 by then, so I might still be around to find out if I was right or not. But I would think probably the ethical question that's likely to confront us is actually, I'll say two things. I think there's an ethical question that's likely to confront us with greater intensity by then, which is a matter of global justice in the distribution of resources. Because clearly, one of the things that the rapidly changing climate is one of the problems it's creating, or rather, it's exacerbating, is that inequality. And so, I think that must feature surely by then, as a more prominent concern. It sort of features in the 2022 declaration in a way, but only in very global universalist terms. But I should think it might be mentioned by name in 2052 if such a declaration is around then. And then the second thing I think is probably that there will no doubt still be a struggle between very closed societies and open societies. That's one of the crossroads that the world seems to be at today, is whether or not societies that prize freedom of expression, freedom of thought, freedom of choice, freedom of the individual, equality within societies, democracy, the rule of law, all the things that are good things and that are important to a humanist, whether those sorts of societies will have succeeded or failed in confronting the challenge, the increasing attraction of closed societies, of totalitarian societies, societies that don't prize either the individual or their freedom of thought, but instead would quite like to control the thought of everyone, and never mind the expression and the choice of everyone, but even the thought of everyone. And I think that obviously what technology offers the proponents of closed societies is a sort of power beyond their wildest dreams. If you see what China is able to do today, for example, in terms of the control it can exert over the people who are subject to its government. And I should think that those tensions by 2052 will have, either they'll still be present and still held in tension, or they'll have boiled over one way or another, or they'll have succeeded, in which case there won't be a 2052 humanist declaration. Let's hope that's not the case. But I think that conflict between open and closed societies will also be something that will have become, I expect, more acute by that time. So there you go. Global injustice, global inequality, and the contrast and struggle between open and closed societies, I'd expect to feature more in that year.
Well, thank you, Andrew. I've really enjoyed this conversation. If any of our listeners want to learn more, I'll put links to the 3 Amsterdam declarations in the show notes. They can find it there. If people want to find you online, where can they do that?
Oh, I don't know really. Twitter, I suppose, is the best place.
Or Humanists, or find out more about Humanists International.
If you want to find out more about Humanists International, the website's very simple. It's humanists.international. And of course, you can also find Humanists International by searching your favourite social media pages. And I'm on Twitter myself at Andrew Copson. It'd be nice to see you there too.
Thank you very much. Andrew Copson of Humanists International.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Leslie.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Links for today's discussion can be found in the show notes. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please subscribe and engage in the conversation. Comment, rate, and review. We'd love to hear your perspective. The Podcast for Inquiry is brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada. We rely entirely on donations to be your voice supporting science, free inquiry, critical thinking, and secularism here in Canada. To our supporters, thank you. If you have not yet contributed, please consider making a donation at centerforinquiry.ca/donate, or becoming a member for only $30 per year at centerforinquiry.ca/join. Your support will help make it possible for us to continue making our collective demand for reason and evidence-based decision-making everywhere. CFIC is on the web at centerforinquiry.ca. Find us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter at CFI Canada. Podcast for Inquiry is produced and edited by Matt Payne, Nikolay Nikitushkin, and Martin Zielinski. Music by Anthony Luzaro. See you next time.